Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I created this anemone card here. It is using the new Spellbinders set that have the anemone flowers as well as the hot foiling plate. I thought I was going to use these foiling plates for the sentiments, but in the end I changed my mind and I used the dies for the sentiments. I do foil the hello, but when I go to cut it, it gets wonky, and I also had it a little bit too close to the anemone. I'm going to foil the anemone on some hot press watercolor paper. I used some cold press in a few videos ago, and when I was experimenting with different cardstocks that I had in my craft room, and I had fairly good success with it. So I thought perhaps I would have good success with hot press watercolor paper because it doesn't have the texture that cold press does. So I have my hot foiling plate facing my paper, and I've got the glimmer foil in between it. I have the pretty side of the foil facing the hot foiling plate, and I'm going to use some Spellbinders yellow tape to tape everything in place to make sure that it doesn't move and shift when I flip it over onto the Glimmer Machine. The Glimmer Machine is already pre-warmed up. Once I've got everything down and my plates down, I click the timer button, and as soon as that green light stops flashing and is solid, it's good to go, and I'm ready to put it through my Big Shot machine. So you do need both the foil machine as well as a die cutting machine or a Big Shot machine for the pressure. One uses the heat, one does the pressure. And anytime I foil now, I immediately foil the solid part of the foil that's left so that I can get double duty out of my foil. Now, I was really quite disappointed with the foiling on the hot press watercolor paper. It doesn't show up well in camera, but it really doesn't give a good solid or good image. So I decided to try cold press again after foiling the solid image there. The solid image I'm doing on hammer mill cardstock, which I know is fabulous for foiling. And you can see how the foil went on there really, really nicely. Those solid pieces, sometimes I use them as is, and sometimes I just use parts of the solid to die cut, and that's what I'm die cutting my hello sentiment out of. The cold press watercolor paper you may have just seen also didn't foil really well, and the one that foiled fairly well before was a Pink Fresh Studio die or hot foil plate, and this is a Spellbinders one, so I'm not sure if that makes any difference, but I ended up going and foiling it onto the hammer mill, and it foiled beautifully, and I'll be using that for my card. Now I have my heart set on doing a watercolor technique with it, and I'm not sure how well that's going to work with the hammer mill cardstock, but I'm going to try it anyways. It's one of those things, if it didn't work, you wouldn't even see it this video, so obviously it worked fairly well. I've used some painter's tape here to tape my piece down to my watercolor board. The watercolor board is just a scrap piece of cardstock, or sorry, chipboard that has some shelf liner glued onto it, and it's just a perfect surface. By taping it down, it helps to eliminate or control a little bit of the warping. I've misted my paper down, and now I'm coloring the flower. I do want the colors for this flower to bleed a little bit, so I'm using a lighter color of the distress ink first, and then I'll go in and dot in some of the darker color. The color that I'm using is called Shaded Lilac, and it is absolutely beautiful and perfect for these flowers. When you go to Google these flowers, they have a huge variety of colors, so the sky's the limit. You can really go crazy with whatever colors you're wanting, but I'm really loving this Shaded Lilac color lately. So I go in once again with the lightest or lighter shade of the color, just basically adding a little bit more water to it, and then I'll dot in some of the more concentrated version of the color and just let those two blend together, and they blend together beautifully. Now, it doesn't show up really, really well on the video, but the cardstock is actually warping a whole lot while I'm working on it. Not so much that the water is pooling because I don't have that much water on top of it, but it is warping a lot as I'm working with it. Now, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that once it dried, it flattened out fairly well. There's still a little bit of warping, but not enough to prevent making a card out of it. As the colors are blending together, I am dotting in more and more of the darker concentrated color just to get some really good shading in there. I want to be able to see the difference with the lighter tones and the darker tones. Once I've got my flower how I like, I put a little bit of black soot in the center of it All of these anemones have really dark centers, very similar to poppies. Once I have that dark center in place, I'm going to put some green on my leaves. There's not a lot of open space with the leaves, but I just want to see a little bit of green on the pieces that do have a little bit of open space. So I'm just adding a little bit of that to that. I'm not doing a lot of shading with the leaves. Like I said, there's not a lot of open space, so you're not really going to see it anyways, but I did want to have a color on there more than just the purple tone. Once that image is completely colored in, I will leave it to dry, and I end up leaving it overnight to dry just so that it's really, really good and dry before I peel it off of the board backing there. So like I said, it dried. It had a little bit of warp in it still, but it's still perfect for putting a card together with it. Once I've got that off my board, I'm lining up the die that comes with the set so that I can cut it out. For dies like this that match images, I do like to tape them in place while I'm die cutting them so that I know it won't shift in my machine. And look how pretty that is. It looks gorgeous with that purple and the holographic foil. Off screen, I die cut the solid part of this image. I thought I was going to use it behind there, but it didn't end up doing anything for it, so I'll just save that for a different project. I off screen die cut the hello sentiment out of some of the solid foil that was done with the scraps, and I'm going to put it on top of the shadow. The shadow, I did die cut a few layers of it out of my scrap cardstock so that I can get some extra dimension with the sentiment on the card. It just is an easy way to get that extra sentiment, and by having die cuts out of scraps, you're just using up some of your scraps, and it's stuff that would be wasted anyways. Once I have my hello on the shadow, I'm just going to use some Distress Collage Medium to glue those shadows, stack them together. For the actual hello part in the center, I put my glue in a really fine tipped bottle so that I can control how much glue went to the back of it, so I didn't have a whole lot of glue seeping out. Once those pieces are all dried, I'm going to glue my card together. I've got a purple mat here that matches the color of the flowers. I'm just going to glue that in place, and I like to put an acrylic block on it so that it holds it in place while it's drying and my hands are free to do other things. And while they're free, I'm going to put some glue on the back of my flower die cut. This one I didn't glue some extra pieces on the back to add dimension, but you certainly could if you wanted that dimension on there. I think it would certainly enhance it as well. Once I have that flower on there, I'm putting that acrylic block to hold it down, and then I'm going to glue on my sentiment. Now the sentiment, because it's stacked, to put an acrylic block on there, I would put one on the flower part and then a different one on the sentiment, just to accommodate for that extra dimension. I have these beautiful iridescent gems from Pink Fresh Studio, and I wanted to put them on the card, and this is actually my first time using them, and I don't have a jewel tool. It's one of those things that you don't realize you need until you try to put jewels on without it. So I'm definitely going to be ordering one ASAP for future projects, because doing it this way with my hands, really not recommended. It was more frustrating than anything. I thought it would work as a good substitute, but you have a hard time getting placement, and some of those jewels are so small it's really hard to grab them with tweezers. So for a little bit of extra sparkle and dimension in the center of the flowers on top of the dark, I'm going to put a little bit of stickles just to add a little bit of sparkle there. There is the finished card. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.